Arkham Horror, the role-playing game, is a tabletop RPG by Edge Studio. I covered the starter box for this game a few months before, and I think due to the fact that Edge Studio is owned by Asmodee, this huge European-based private equity firm, when the starter box for this game came out, there wasn't a clear indication of what the full rules would look like, when the full rules would come out, or believe it or not, if the full rules would actually ever come out. So when I reviewed that starter set, I was just kind of confused and rankled by the limitations that all starter sets have, mostly because I didn't know what this product line was intended to be. Well, in very short order, they released this core rulebook, and I went into it very skeptically. I really just wanted to know if the character creation was going to be robust enough, and if they were going to deliver on the lore, enemies, and GM advice. Long story short, they created a pretty compelling RPG, but really mostly in terms of the unique dice resolution mechanics. I don't want to get into the history of Arkham Horror, the board game and card game again. I think here, I want to address the bigger question for RPG gamers, which is, how does this game play? Long story short here is that it's a really fast, brutal, simplified way of experiencing Lovecraft investigation and horror as compared to the master of the genre, Call of Cthulhu. But I think the magic of this game is exactly that feature, the simplicity. The rules feel fresh and really so unique that I had to run this game for myself just to see how it played. In this video, I want to walk you through the core rules of the game, and then at the end, share with you my takeaways from running this game for a group, and then finally give you my honest pros and cons about the game as I see it. First, let's go over the contents of the core rulebook and see how this game actually works. The rules. This is, in my opinion, the crowning achievement of this game. The way the dice work is that you use pools of d6s. You need lots of these dice. I'd say that each player should have maybe 8 d6s of one color and 6 of another, just to be safe. And GMs will need maybe 20 of one color and 12 of another. Maybe the best way to illustrate how the dice work is to show a couple of example scenes. There are 2 kinds of scenes in the game, narrative and structured. Let's start with a narrative scene. Let's say that we have a party of 3 investigators, Mary, Frank, and Tobias. They've entered Velma's diner and they need to casually ask around to get more information about some strange occurrences happening in Arkham. If our character is healthy and uninjured and not beset by horror of any sort, we start with 6 normal dice in our pool. The character sheet has a space for 6 dice, but I actually designed and 3D printed a little dice holder along with some Cthulhu-themed placeholders that act to reduce a dice pool maximum so that keeping the dice and slots sorted is a little easier. If you're interested in the files to print these, let me know and I'll find a way to post them somewhere, probably in a public post on my Patreon. But okay, Tobias starts this narrative scene with 6 dice, and I will use those dice to attempt different so-called complex actions. Let's say Tobias walks up to a patron in this diner and wants to ask them about the recent disturbing news in Arkham as part of our team's investigation. To do that, I would want to invoke the presence skill. Tobias's presence rating is 4, which means I can spend any number of dice from my available pool in order to try and roll a 4 or more, which would count as a success. In other words, a 1, 2, or 3 would be a failure. Once rolled, those dice are spent and gone for the rest of the narrative scene. So I roll. I get a 6 and a 2. That 6 counts as a success. Now, this was just a normal action that only called for 1 success. But let's say Tobias is approached by a patron in the diner who is asking about why he's being so curious. This is one tough customer. He's clearly from out of town, dark and ominous looking. If Tobias wants to attempt a complex action in order to ascertain this man's intentions or motivations, we would need to invoke the intuition skill, which Tobias unfortunately has a rating of 6 in. That means he'd have to roll a 6 for it to count as a success. But since this guy is so dark and creepy, the GM might say we need 2 successes to accomplish the task. While we only have 4 dice left for this scene, you don't want to burn up all your dice too fast in a narrative scene because then you're just sort of stuck waiting for everyone else to use up theirs. But we need to roll 2 6s here, so let's just roll 3 of our remaining dice. In this case, we only rolled 1 6, but alas, we have a so-called knack, which you can think of as a special ability, called Resolute in this case. And this says we can reroll 1 die per scene when using Intuition or Resolve. Let's use it, why not? We reroll 1 die here, and boom, we got that second 6, which means Tobias is able to discern this man's shady intent, whatever it may be. You don't actually have to wait until everyone uses up their dice in order to end a narrative scene. The table can end the scene if either the players or the GM agrees that the scene is sort of finished, which makes sense. And actually, it's the mark of a good GM who can swiftly and decisively end a scene when it's time to move on. Now, structured scenes are basically how you manage combat in this game. Instead of the dice filling up only once per scene, in structured scenes they fill up at the beginning of every round, which, as you might imagine, makes things a lot more interesting mechanically. Another interesting design choice is that all the characters from one side can perform as many actions as their dice pool affords them, and then the other side performs all of their actions. And when it's your side's turn, you can mix and split the order of your party's actions however you wish. This is a huge abstraction in terms of how time passes and how it really works, but I have to admit, it frees you up to make some tactical decisions with your party. You're not just isolated to all of your actions in one go. You can coordinate a sequence of a mix of movements and actions across your entire party and present a more complex round of decisions before it's the enemy's turn. There are a couple of interesting limitations. One is that a character can only attempt the exact same task only once during their turn. Then they can try that task again in the next turn. Also, a character can attack multiple opponents with the same weapon during a single turn, and attack the same opponent with different weapons, but they can't attack the same opponent with the same weapon more than once in a turn. It's a weird sort of arbitrary set of rules here, but I think it's meant to force players to think dynamically and keep the scene interesting. As far as what making an attack looks like, you're usually either rolling your melee combat or your ranged combat skill. Depending on the circumstance of the attack, such as the range and the characteristics of the enemy itself, you may need to roll 1, 2, or even 3 successes in order to land the attack. If you do land the attack, each weapon has a damage rating, and that's how much you reduce the enemy's dice pool limit by. So in effect, every character's dice pool acts as both their turn economy and their hit points. Each weapon also has an injury rating. This tells you how many successes you need to roll in a single roll in order to inflict a so-called injury on the opponent. Let's say that our fisherman PC Tobias enters combat and immediately gets hit for 2 points of damage. In the case of a full rack of dice, we'd actually remove 2 dice and they would not get refilled at the start of the next turn. If Tobias takes so much damage that his dice pool is reduced to 0, then he is considered wounded, and that means he's generally incapacitated and can't perform any significant actions. A character can actually push through the pain and refill their dice pool back to maximum by straining themselves, but this will incur an injury. Anytime you suffer an injury, you roll on this injuries table and suffer the consequence. If you don't get these injuries healed, then you add to every subsequent injury roll. Once your roll gets to around 7 or 8, the consequences are very serious. At 10, you're at death's door, and 11 or above means your character is done for. Healing comes in the form of rest. Damage just sort of melts away with a solid night's sleep or 12 hours of light, undisturbed activity. Healing injuries requires a week of rest generally, or a knowledge check to clear it relatively quickly. This is not very realistic, but rather more like a board game or a video game, and meant to keep characters in play and the story moving forward. I thought sort of one unique take on advantage and disadvantage in this game is that if you're rolling with advantage, you add a temporary d6 to the roll, and after that roll is done, the d6 goes away. But you get to enjoy whatever result that extra d6 provided. For disadvantage, you also add a temporary d6 to the roll, but then remove the highest die rolled. Okay, so the horror mechanic is the final major component of the dice in this game, and it's really central to the whole player experience. In the course of play, PCs will pick up horror dice. These will actually replace regular dice in their roll, and they will take precedence and stay in the pool whenever a player has to remove dice for any reason. When the pool is replenished at the start of a narrative scene or structured round, then those horror dice come right back. When you roll for complex actions, these horror dice actually act just like regular dice in terms of their numbers, with a couple of big exceptions. The first is that you can't use any knacks, items, or other means to re-roll a horror die. And the second is that if you roll a 1 on a horror die, your character suffers a trauma. Traumas work just like injuries. You roll on a table and suffer the consequences. But if you have unresolved traumas prior to this roll, then you will add 1 for each pre-existing trauma. As you can see, the higher results will trigger the negative side of your character's main personality trait, and at 11 or more, your character's mind is kaput in classic Lovecraftian RPG fashion. Finally, there is insight. This is essentially the game's meta currency. You can spend it to do these things. Nothing too surprising here. I do have reservations about this meta power though. It's not game breaking or anything, but it does brush up against the traditional notion of the GM as the arbiter of the reality of the collective story being told. The hope here is that players don't abuse this and break the delicate immersion of the scene. There are 8 archetypes to choose from. Each one gives you higher maximums on certain skills, as well as access to certain knacks, which are those special abilities. Each knack with an asterisk next to it means it is exclusive to that archetype. As you can see from the Mystic, more than half of the available knacks are exclusive to them, whereas with the Hunter, it's mostly generic knacks. Tier 4 abilities for all of the archetypes are always exclusive to that archetype. As far as these knacks are concerned, the font that they chose for this menu is pretty unfortunate, but the actual breadth and mechanical design of these knacks is impressive, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the play variety for this game. It's hard for me to show you just how decent this collection of abilities is without just showing you all of them, but I'll point out a few in order to highlight their variability. Never Give Up says that if you roll a 6 while trying to avoid an attack in a reaction, you can heal 1 damage. That's pretty huge. This one called Lore really jumped out at me. You can banish a creature to its home world or plane for 1 or several months, but if you roll a 1 on the attempt, you pick up a horror die. If you roll 3 or more 1s, then your character is also banished to that world or plane. That's essentially the end of your character, unless the GM wants to take the whole story off the rails and into some weird dimension or alien planet for just your character. I think one of the biggest themes with many of these knacks is the quid pro quo. You get a benefit, but either pay a cost or risk paying a cost in return. Premonition is one of many examples. With this one, your character just takes a horror point up front, but then everyone around them gets +1 die to every reaction roll against a single enemy or threat. Here is one of the cleverest designs of them all. With Prescient, at the start of each session, you roll 4 dice and set them aside. Then throughout the session, you can replace 1 die that you were about to roll with one of the ones that you set aside at the beginning, using its value instead. At the end of the session, you will pick up 2 horror per die that you didn't use. It's designed so that you get to enjoy some predetermined successes, hopefully, but you're also heavily coerced to use any crappy rolls that you may have made as well. This general mechanic is used in at least a couple of more knacks. To be fair, not all of the knacks are great. These 2 universal knacks, for example, are really kind of crummy because they just aren't that useful. If you look at your character sheet, your character can only gain 8 knacks in total, at least as far as I can tell. You definitely wouldn't want to waste one of those precious slots on some of these weaker knacks. I won't dwell too much on equipment in this game beyond what I've already described about their damage rating and injury thresholds, but one very notable feature is that ammo works with a roll of the dice. Take the Colt 1911 for example. It's got 2 ammunition. That means each time you use the weapon to attack, if any of the dice rolled on the attempt comes up as a 1, then one of these ammo slots is temporarily crossed out until you can find more ammo. I've seen a number of games employ this method of tracking ammo, and I think it's a really good approach. You have limited ammo, but you don't really have to track it. It's just a game of chance on when you'll run out. The magical relics listed are generally what you might expect. Anytime you use one, there's a sort of risk or devil's bargain mechanic. I don't want to spoil them in this video because I think part of the fun of these Lovecraft-themed RPGs is to let players discover the often horrible price for using a relic. The magical tomes are really much the same in terms of doing something, but for a price. One thing I want to point out though is that a tome can also help you with related lore or knowledge checks, so they do confer a passive bonus to your character. I thought that was nice. The book spends about 30 pages describing pretty much all the locations in the Arkham Horror universe, but it does it in a way that I'm not sure I find super useful. The small city of Arkham itself, I have to admit, is lavishly described with dozens of different locations written out, but take a closer look. The Arkham Sanatorium, for example. Here are 3 pages that sort of describe the location in broad strokes. As a GM, you have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in order to extract and develop the plot. If they had at least included an encounter map for each of these famed board game locations, it would have been an absolute triumph. Even just a handful of maps like the ones that they provided in the starter set would have been a boon for GMs. Another missed opportunity was not providing all of these famous characters from the Arkham Horror universe as pre-gens. In fact, this may be the biggest oversight of all because the IP is best known for its memorable characters, as first featured in the original board game, but then again in the card game and the mini novels. Locations like Miskatonic University have massive potential, but in this chapter only get 4 paragraphs of almost teaser text. The university could easily fill a 200-page setting and adventure supplement, and maybe one day it will. Innsmouth is another location that warrants an entire book of its own, though to be fair, you do get much more than average detail about this town in particular. I absolutely scoured this GM section for 2 reasons. One, I generally wanted to know if the book provided any unique information or advice for running this relatively unique rule set, and 2, I actually needed all the help I could get because I was preparing to run the game myself. In short, I'd say this GM section is fine. It does touch on the unique aspects of the game, including managing the dice pools and handling narrative versus structured scenes, and there is a surface level discussion of generically running a horror game, along with brief descriptions of 8 different tones and 3 distinct themes your game could take on. The chapter on Ancient Ones is a mixed bag. I think if you're running this game right, your players won't face an Ancient One for many sessions. The lead up would involve building up to that final encounter, which is why I don't want to spoil any of the descriptions here in this video. They really did lean in on some of 14 of the Ancient Ones found in the Cthulhu mythos. The descriptions of their various natures and their abilities are substantial with some of them, but with others, you actually don't get too much. So I guess on the whole, this chapter is a bit uneven in terms of its granularity. If you want a hardcore, comprehensive treatment of Lovecraftian gods, and you're willing to do a bit of porting from Call of Cthulhu stat blocks, get your hands on the Malleus Monstrorum Volume 2, Deities of the Mythos. The chapter on NPCs and enemies is solid. There are 13 generic, non-magical NPCs statted out. Notice how relatively simple a stat block is. Each character in this game is composed of 4 elements. Their dice pool, which ranges from 2 to 12, their skill ratings, which tell you what is required to roll a success, their knacks, and their equipment. As far as named NPCs, there are unfortunately only 5 listed. You could actually fill a whole book with these, considering how many investigators there are from the Arkham Horror universe. It would be cool to see that book of pre-gens published for this game one day. As far as supernatural enemies who aren't Ancient Ones, there are unfortunately only 10 in this book. They run the gamut on variety, but I mean, let's face it, in the Cthulhu verse there are dozens and dozens more that could have been described. Maybe the publishers are holding out to see if a monster manual is warranted for this product line. And finally, there are 7 so-called eldritch monstrosities. You can think of these as mid-level bosses. They all pack a punch and are pretty hard to kill. Not nearly as unkillable as Ancient Ones, but they're definitely the sort of thing that could unexpectedly kill a whole party. Again, with only 7, you get the distinct sense that this is more of a teaser than a full bestiary. And finally, there's a sample adventure that actually goes a long way in teaching a GM how to structure a game, which I guess is the point of including it. I appreciate the overall attempt here, but if you were to put this adventure on a spectrum where on one end the stakes are low and more personal, or maybe local in nature, and on the other end, the whole planet or maybe the universe hangs in the balance, this scenario is very much on the low stakes end. Also, the final threat is pretty unsatisfying in terms of how it works and what it wants in the world. So I prepped and ran a game of Arkham Horror, the RPG, for a group of patrons, and we had a really great time. Here are my takeaways from the session. Switching between narrative to structured scenes can be awkward. I couldn't find in the book where or how you might transition from a narrative scene, say where the PCs are just talking and investigating, to a sudden structured scene, which is how you handle combat. So I just made up a rule that their dice tracks get filled up if they suddenly start a fight in the middle of a narrative scene. Then, when they're done with the fight and want to do some narrative scene style investigating again, does it switch back to an actual narrative scene where they only have one rack of dice to spend? These two scene types proved to be a tad awkward. Extra rolled successes don't do anything. I was sure that if you rolled extra successes on a check, especially in combat, that it would do something extra, namely deal more damage. But the rulebook does not stipulate that. Extra successes mean nothing. The way I ran combat was I gave 1 extra damage dealt for every extra success rolled on an attack roll, and this had the effect of speeding combat up, which was actually kind of nice, and also had the effect of providing more satisfaction to the person rolling. The game yearns for tactics. Since you're meant to show players the dice of all the enemies, they're able to see enemy health and action economy, and thusly strategize on their turn. That's cool and all, but it means that you as the GM need to place enemies all around a map and include more environmental hazards and obstructions in order to make a more tactical environment. And alright, here are my final thoughts on the Arkham Horror RPG full core rulebook. Cons. Could use more relics, tomes, and monsters. The core rulebook just doesn't have enough of any of these things. I feel like they were holding back or reserving this content for supplemental books, which is fine, I guess. It just doesn't feel like a comprehensive tome that you could run long campaigns from as it stands. Could use some more encounter maps. I would have loved to have seen more encounter maps included in the digital version of this game. If you want the motherlode of awesome Lovecraftian mystery encounter maps, you can check out Love Maps on Patreon. You can download all of their dozens of maps for something like $7 US. I used some of their maps for my session, and they were really great. The famous Arkham Horror characters could have been pre-gens. The Arkham Horror universe is really known more than anything for its evocative artwork and its characters. These investigators have been around with us for years, and they've been the stars of the board games, card games, and over a dozen novels. They're the face of this intellectual property, and it would have been fitting if the creators of the RPG had given them to us in playable format. After all, you play as them in both the board games and the card games. It's a bit of a head scratcher as to why you can't readily play as them here via the core rulebook. Pros. Dice mechanics are fast and refreshing. The dice pool that acts as a health and action economy tracker is pretty fun in practice. It even integrates tracking your horror level, so it ends up doing 3 things at once, indicating health, action, and horror. And it does these things well. Character breakdown is simple and efficient. I think when comparing this game's character sheet to Call of Cthulhu, this one is just a more accessible, easy to use, and comprehensible collection of information. I appreciate the relative simplicity of a character's makeup in this game. Artwork and presentation is extremely professional. Since the publisher here got to use the artwork from the Arkham Horror IP, they got access to some phenomenal illustrations, and the layout by Paco Dana and Sonia Gallardo Marquez is just top-notch. Maximum quality stuff that you'd expect from a big games publisher. Can somewhat easily port stuff from Call of Cthulhu. Let's face it, this core rulebook is not complete. It does not have enough monsters, gods, tomes, or magical items. But you know what game does have enough of that stuff? Call of Cthulhu. So the question is, could you easily port Call of Cthulhu monsters and items into this game? The answer is, it's not rocket science. It would take a bit of sitting down and hashing it out a bit, but that's what LLMs are for, right? Anyway, that's all I have for Arkham Horror the RPG. Make sure you leave your thoughts down below, and I've left links for everything. Thanks as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.